The rain had been falling all morning, turning the narrow streets of Port Townsend into silver ribbons that glistened beneath the muted glow of the street lamps. The air carried that particular scent of salt and cedar that clung to everything in this coastal town. Ethan Miller stood by the window of his small apartment above the bookshop, a chipped mug of tea warming his hands. His phone lay silent on the table until it suddenly buzzed, its vibration sharp against the wood. The name on the screen made his chest tighten. It was Margaret, the housekeeper at his uncle's estate. He answered at once. Her voice was low and urgent, carrying a weight that seemed to seep into the room. She told him that Charles Whitman, his uncle, had taken a turn for the worse. There was no certainty in her tone, only the faint tremor of someone who knew the end might be near. Within an hour, Ethan was driving through the wet streets, the windscreen wipers beating in steady rhythm. The sea appeared through gaps in the trees, restless and dark. He had not visited his uncle in months, and the silence between them had grown thick over the years. Charles had always been a reserved man, as hard to read as the fog that rolled in from the bay. When Ethan reached the old Whitman estate, the iron gates creaked open reluctantly. The house rose from the mist like something carved from another century, its tall windows reflecting the last dull light of the day. Margaret met him at the door, her expression both relieved and wary. She led him inside without a word, the scent of polished wood and old paper filling the hall. Charles lay in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, a thick blanket drawn over his knees. His skin was pale, his once sharp eyes softened, but still holding a certain force. When he saw Ethan, his lips curved into the faintest smile. "You came," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "I was not sure you would." Ethan pulled up a chair and sat close. The fire crackled, the only other sound in the room. Charles studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "There is something I must tell you, Ethan. Something I have carried for many years. You may not thank me for it, but you must hear it." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in the corner, glancing towards the window where the rain beat against the glass. Whatever his uncle was about to reveal, it was clear it was not meant for anyone else to hear. Ethan leaned forward, sensing the gravity in his uncle's gaze. The room seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as the firelight flickered across the walls. "Before I leave this world," Charles said slowly, "I need you to keep a secret. One that must never reach the ears of the family. If it does, everything they have will crumble." Ethan felt the words settle over him like a weight, though he did not yet understand their shape. He could feel, even then, that the decision he was about to make would not leave him unchanged. The firelight threw long shadows across the room, shaping the lines of Charles Whitman's face into something almost ghostly. His eyes fixed on Ethan with a rare intensity. "You will not write this down," Charles said. "You will not speak of it. You will carry it alone." Ethan nodded, unsure whether it was agreement or a reflex. His uncle's frail hands gripped the blanket tightly, as though the secret itself might spill out if he let go. "Years ago," Charles began, "I was involved in an accident. It was not the sort of accident you can report, nor one you can explain. It took a life." The voice in which he said this was not trembling, but it was stripped of all pretense. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He tried to speak, but Charles raised a hand. "No. Listen. I took steps to ensure no one could trace it back to me. Those steps, they were not clean. Money changed hands. Papers disappeared. People looked the other way." The words hung in the air, thick as the scent of burning wood. Outside, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle, but the world beyond the windows seemed impossibly distant. "If this truth is ever revealed," Charles continued, "the Whitman name will be dragged through the courts, the press, the streets. Everything your cousins have built will collapse. Your aunt, she would not survive the shame." Margaret's footsteps moved faintly in the corridor, and Ethan realized she had deliberately given them privacy. The house felt like a vault, its heavy walls trapping this confession inside. Ethan's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Why me?" "Because," Charles said, "you are the only one I trust to be strong enough. And because you know what it is to keep silent." There was something in that statement that made Ethan's stomach turn, but he let it pass. He felt the weight of the promise forming like a chain, cold and heavy, wrapping around him. Charles reached for his hand, his grip surprisingly firm.
Swear it.
Ethan hesitated, then gave the smallest nod.
I swear.
And just like that, the chain locked. 2 days later, Port Townsend woke beneath a slate-gray sky. The sea was calm, but the gulls cried with a restless edge. Ethan had not slept well. Every sound in the night had seemed to carry meaning: the creak of the floorboards, the tap of a loose window pane. He walked into town, his boots leaving dark prints on the damp wooden boards of the pier. The fishermen were hauling in their catch, voices carrying over the water. A few nodded to him, but most kept to themselves. Port Townsend was a place where silence was a form of currency, traded and kept with care. At the bakery, he overheard 2 women whispering in the corner. Something about the Whitman estate. Something about an old story from years back. He caught only fragments: a man missing, a stormy night, unanswered questions. His chest tightened again. He bought his bread and left quickly, the scent of fresh loaves clinging to him as he stepped back into the cold air. The unease followed him all day. At the bookshop, a customer browsing the history section mentioned the Whitman name with a certain knowing tone. Ethan smiled politely, but his hands were cold. By evening, the rain had returned. Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the single lamp that lit the room. He thought of the secret like a locked box at the back of his mind, but every sound outside felt like a key turning in the lock. Margaret called him again. This time, her voice was strained. The doctor had been by. Charles's health was failing fast. Ethan drove out at once. The road to the estate was slick with rain, the headlights catching the wet leaves that clung to the tarmac. When he arrived, the house was almost entirely dark. Only the drawing room glowed faintly. Margaret met him at the door, pressing a finger to her lips. "He's sleeping," she whispered. "But there's something you should see." She led him through a side corridor he had never used before. The wallpaper was older here, faded patterns of ivy winding up towards the ceiling. At the end of the corridor was a narrow door. Margaret unlocked it with a small brass key. Inside was a room no larger than a pantry. But instead of shelves of food, it was lined with filing cabinets, their drawers labeled in neat handwriting. A desk stood in the middle, and on it lay an old leather-bound ledger. Margaret opened the ledger to a page marked with a ribbon. Ethan's eyes scanned the neat columns of numbers and names. He saw dates that matched the year his uncle had spoken of. He saw large sums of money paid out to individuals he did not recognize. Margaret's voice was low. "I have never touched this before. But if something happens to Mr. Whitman, I thought you should know it exists." Ethan closed the ledger. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. The next morning, Ethan woke to find a folded note pushed under his door. No name. Just a single line in block letters. "We know." His first instinct was disbelief, then fear. The letters were sharp, deliberate. Someone had taken the trouble to deliver it without being seen. At the bookshop, he found it hard to focus. Customers came and went, the bell above the door chiming over and over. Twice he thought he saw the same man pass by the window, but when he stepped outside, the street was empty. By midday, Margaret called again. There had been a visitor at the estate, a man in a dark coat who asked too many questions about the past. She had told him nothing, but he had left her unsettled. That night, Ethan could not bring himself to sleep. The note lay on the table where he had left it, its presence like an open wound. The wind rose outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried out into the dark. 2 days later, Ethan saw him. The man in the dark coat, standing at the end of the pier. He was looking out at the water, hands in his pockets, his posture easy but watchful. When Ethan walked past, the man turned slightly. His face was pale, his eyes a sharp gray that missed nothing. He smiled faintly, as though they had met before. "You are Charles Whitman's nephew," he said. Ethan hesitated. "And you are?" The man did not answer once. "Call me Mason," he said finally. "I have questions. I am not answering them." Mason's smile did not falter. "You will. Eventually." He walked away without another word, leaving Ethan with the uneasy sense that Mason was not a man who gave up easily. Margaret's call came just after dusk.
You need to come now.
When Ethan arrived, the estate was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He found his uncle in the same chair by the fire, but his breathing was labored. Charles opened his eyes as Ethan approached. "There is more you must know," he whispered. "The man looking for me. I knew him once. He has reason to want this secret brought to light." Ethan leaned closer. "Who is he?" Charles's gaze drifted to the fire. "A brother of the one who died." The words landed like stones. The room seemed suddenly too warm, the fire too bright. Charles's hand found Ethan's once more. "You must be careful. There are those who would see you destroyed to reach me." After his uncle fell asleep, Ethan wandered the hallways. His footsteps echoed on the polished floors. He found himself outside the little records room again. This time he opened more drawers. Letters. Receipts. Newspaper clippings about a boating accident in the bay 20 years ago. A man lost at sea during a sudden storm. No body recovered. In one clipping, a grainy photograph showed a younger Charles Whitman standing on the pier, speaking to the police. Beside him was another man, Mason's eyes staring out from the paper, though his face was younger. It was near midnight when Ethan left the estate. The rain had stopped, but the streets glistened under the street lamps. He had not gone far when a figure stepped out from the shadows. "Mason, we should talk," Mason said. Ethan shook his head. "I owe my uncle my silence. And I owe my brother justice," Mason replied. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. They stood in the damp quiet, the sea breathing somewhere beyond the buildings. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Secrets rot in the dark, Ethan. They poison everything." Ethan said nothing. The next day, the storm arrived. The wind howled in from the bay, rattling the shutters on the estate. Ethan stayed close to his uncle, but the old man seemed lost in some private reckoning. By late afternoon, Mason had returned. This time, he did not wait at the pier. He came to the gates, speaking to Margaret with a voice that carried through the rain. Ethan stepped outside. The wind tugged at his coat. "You can keep your promise," Mason said, "or you can save yourself from what comes next. The choice is yours." Somewhere behind him, the sea crashed against the rocks. The air was heavy with salt and thunder. Ethan felt the chain of his promise tighten around him, and he realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the one he now faced within.